But first, we've got to talk about how monopoly capitalism is consolidating itself, how neoliberalism is consolidating itself. We're in a situation where the system keeps getting rocked. In 2008, an enormous amount of wealth was destroyed by the Wall Street meltdown. Even the jobs that were added back into the economy, more than half of them were temp jobs, were low paying, that fed into the freelance economy. Austerity took place across the globe, and the financial sector was recapitalized and consolidated further without any substantive or systemic accountability or reform. Several weeks into the coronavirus crisis, which is claiming many lives, over 70,000, and has led to tens of millions of jobs losses. Now, even Steve Mnuchin himself has suggested that we could reach above 20%. I think that is almost absolute. That is a certainty. Even with all of these shocks to the system and all of this endless evidence that this way of doing business, this way of designing the economy that rewards shareholders, that consolidates capital, that has no power or protection for workers, increases inequality, decreases lifespan for many, and does not work for the vast majority of people. Yes, more and more people are dissatisfied with the system, but actual political and material threats to it are vanishing. And in fact, several weeks into COVID, we're seeing a consolidation. We see enormous job losses and excellent performance by the stock market. Now, of course, can we keep going with greater and greater unemployment and greater stock performance? Probably not. At some point, we're going to need to cushion more people and get some more people back into the workforce. But even if that happens, and even if there is some trend towards social unrest, there is still no structural threat to the overwhelming consolidation of capital. And it is very likely, as the trend goes now, that even if the economy, quotes, starts to somewhat normalize and people become somewhat cushioned, they'll be going into the next wave of both monopoly power in the financial and tech sectors, and also decreased labor power and capacity. And I want to talk a little bit about a couple of things that go along with this. First of all is the democratic bailout that I alluded to before. This bailout does not have wage protections as put forward by Pramila Jayapal. It does not have any systemic accountability that we've seen on the corporate sector so far at all. It doesn't have something like, as an example, card check, which would be an enormous shot in the arm for labor unions right now. It does have apparently bailout funds for lobbyists and debt collectors. Now, are there going to be some laudatory things in this bill and some things that are going to plug some vital gaps in people's immediate material needs? I have no doubt. And we'll see how much they get whittled down or what finally gets passed after Mitch McConnell has taken an axe to it in the Senate. But it is very clear that the Democratic Party leadership is absolutely firmly entrenched in the center or center-right of the neoliberal consensus. No change there. The IMF is forecasting a contraction of 3% global output and ongoing economic damage as a result of this. And of course, we can expect the World Bank and IMF to warn and potentially push for some narrow stimulus on one hand, and then just like in the United States, on the other hand, we're already seeing this with some Republicans, all of a sudden we're back to deficit talk, which is going to be another push in the United States for going after Medicare and Social Security, and already is one from these vicious assaults on food stamps and other vital programs by the Trump administration. Neoliberalism so far is being strengthened. Monopoly capital in the financial sector and in the tech sector is consolidating over all walks of life. Small businesses are collapsing, feeding more workers either into long-term unemployment or making them vulnerable to the Uber and temp economy as things start to kind of slowly reopen. Now, and of course, on the political terrain, what we have seen since the outset of this virus is Bernie Sanders' campaign folding, the nomination of Joe Biden. In Massachusetts, Ed Markey is trailing Joe Kennedy in the polls. And the German core, along with the Netherlands and others in the European Union, have not budged at all on loosening monetary policy or going against austerity to help the Southern zone, even in the midst of the corona pandemic. I say this not because I want people to feel defeated and dispirited and like there's no possibility of a future. Of course there is. But if we're not real about the enormous odds that are stacked against working people and poor people and the enormous structural consolidation of capital, then we're deluding ourselves. We're telling ourselves a bedtime story. We need to be very real. There are cracks in the ideological foundations to some extent. There is some labor unrest, but the truth is that these systems are not only surviving, they're finding new ways of inventing themselves that could see them extend out their hegemony for decades into the future. Look at what Andrew Cuomo is doing in New York. He's taking this crisis to turn the city into the next level of an incubator for the Bill Gates campaign against public education, the Google model of surveillance-dominated smart cities, which undermine collective efforts, public investments, and turn the economy into even more temp and delivery, underpaid and non-unionized jobs. Now, there's no doubt that labor is getting more active again. We saw the incredible organizing of people like Chris Smalls at Amazon. We see even models from the center left, like in South Korea, or the incredible resiliency and success of the Communist Party in Kerala, having very effective relative global responses to COVID, to Corona. We're seeing, obviously, an ongoing draw and interest in new ways of designing the economy, in new ways of taking away corporate power, building serious social safety nets, a recognition that even as this rise of nationalism is happening, that there's a deep global interdependence when we're talking about pandemics, the environment, or labor itself, and also a need and interest to build local, anti-fragile, and responsive institutions. We can move forward in a constructive way, but we cannot be a marginal subculture. We cannot be delusional about how powerful capital is. And we need and absolutely must, and Benjamin Fong has a new very good piece on this, on the cultural baggage of the left, we need to find ways to meet with, add to, and synchronize with actually existing institutions, whether it be mainline labor organizations, or try to engage in constructive and reciprocal efforts to broaden out this politics so it is applicable and relevant for the many and not the few, and not relegated to an irrelevant backwater who can, as Daniel Bessner says, argue endlessly about small things because it has no serious prospect for power. Neoliberalism is able to use this crisis to reassert itself. We need to fight with every fiber of our beings against that happening. And we need to do that in a grounded, real, and strategic way, and that cannot allow us for any magical thinking. You guys, want to add?
Yeah, there's big news right now is that it looks like Uber is going to gobble up Grubhub, and
right.
And further assert itself in regular life in this country. Across the world, you're seeing global finance completely retreating from the third and developing world and returning to the United States. It's so yes, there's a crisis, right? But the reaction does not necessarily create something better. What it has actually done is it's created worse crises for other people. So yeah, we need to get as far away from any kind of magical thinking that these things are just going to right themselves, right? Because there's a crisis. I mean, the only way we're going to be able to match our opponents is with this kind of, serious organizing. That's not always going to be glamorous. It's not always going to be sexy, but it's that kind of daily on the ground struggle that's going to prepare us to deal with massive multinational corporations, massive financial international structures, and our political enemies, which we've been learning a lot in the past few months about how effective they still are at in the United States, especially at defeating any kind of left-wing project.
Yeah, I think like that's why I feel like part of this job is making sure people don't waste their hope in the wrong places. And to me, like one of those things just on my mind lately is like if we're discussing like voting strategy for the general election, we're not actually like keeping our eye on those things or building connections with like the labor parties that we need to. Like it's just such a we need to stop indulging pointless conversations, basically.
Yeah. And we need to stop indulging fantasy politics, and we need to stop indulging, kind of like, moral extremism. I mean, all of these things that, again, they sound like sub-pocket, and I wish they were sub-pocket irrelevant conversations, but the extent to which they even spend any time undermining our efforts to actually building something that's really constructive and strategic, they're a problem. We need to address them. And I do want to spend, and we will spend more time on the show, talking specifically to more people in the labor movement across the board about what can be constructively done. And I think, that's a very, very important site. There's still some, and again, even with regards to the voting, I mean, look, I make no secret. Obviously, I think voting tactically is a no-brainer. I think even if we understand that labor is key to all of this, then we have to look at things like who is a president's NLRB appointment's going to be, and then the compelling obviousness to get rid of the Republicans, again, becomes just totally obvious and very easy analysis. But the point is of where the most primary focus of energy and attention is. And there's plenty of people that want to have, just like you're saying, Matt, there's a lot of people that want to, still want to have some type of parasocial relationship with the Democratic Party and tell themselves a fantasy about how we're working on it and the Democratic Party is really good and all, total fantasy, total nonsense. Arguably, the Democratic Party is put simply, look, there's been no structural shift in the Democratic Party in the last several years, even despite the most incredible, valiant efforts of Bernie Sanders and others, who followed in his lead. There is no structural shift there. And everything from who the nominee is and the relationship to this crisis proves that beyond any shadow of a doubt. You can find individual people who've slightly moved to the left. And even frankly there, you have to contextualize. Like, has Gavin Newsom been relatively better than Andrew Cuomo? Sure. Frankly, I'm going to say that specifically in California's case, Bernie Sanders crushed California. And there's a different specific calculus there. But as a national effort, none at all. But then on the other hand, and Dustin Gostala has pointed this out really well, like, the relevance of doing a 2% protest vote that only actually reinforces how marginalized this politics is, achieves absolutely nothing. It does nothing. So, we need to keep both of those things in mind.
I want to stress that it's both sides of that conversation are selling hope, and it's just it's complete bullshit on both sides. Like the left isn't gonna sit and like turn this into a victory if we all like decide to vote correctly on the general election day. Like that's not going to work. And likewise, the Democratic Party, like I honestly think we need to look at this as if Biden thinks he doesn't need the left at all, so fuck the left, and he might be right. So if we go and make this all about like, oh, we're not going to give you our vote, what does it look like if he wins, which he might actually do? Then we've just spent this entire time advertising how they don't need us.
You need to reinvent the map if the terrain is not working for you. And I don't mean that in terms of, gut off and go marginalize, but you need to think of, okay, how do we hold back the damage? And then what are the long-term prospects to actually reorient politics? Because look, Bernie and these electoral projects offered us incredible. This is why I unapologetically focused on them, because they offered the possibility of potentially reversing decades in a much shorter period of time. Now they've failed, so we have to get back to thinking in those decades-long terms, basically.
Yeah, I just something else to just like to make us think about what's going on in the world is like, if you look at Europe and what Germany is doing right now, like Germany is basically holding on to like the old EU line, right? The old neoliberal line, despite this massive crisis, right?
Yep.
And there's just some people who had this idea that just because of the gravity of the situation, that these organizations were going to, wake up, right? And they have. The Democratic Party has it in this country, and the European Union is continuing its role as a neoliberal institution. That's not, and I guess the second analysis too is like, well, that's not enough on our part to just point that out, right? We need to start really seriously figuring out how we're going to deal with that problem, because it's not going to crumble on its own. And that's what we're learning is like they will actually go down with the ship rather.
Well, and I think also that there's a lot of resiliency in it. Like I think that actually, this is one thing that we can't be teleological, right? Even from like a Marxist perspective. I think Marx read capital very well. He saw globalization. He saw monopoly coming. He saw the natural tendencies of how capital would reinforce itself and how it would consolidate. We see that undoubtedly in today's world. There's nothing mystical about it. There's a much greater concentration of corporate power and wealth in the modern iteration. And previous, again, the Keynesian reform effort was pushed back. It was rolled back starting in the 70s and coming through to today. And on the other hand, I still think, because we can see that, obviously you couldn't anticipate everything. There's different, there's a lot of complexities to this. But one thing that isn't, projected in that story is the idea that monopoly platform capitalism can figure out different ways of inventing its way out of different crises. And actually, it's done a pretty good job at that. And I think that's another thing, again, that we need to be really real about. So even just the idea that, okay, like the Germans are going to wake up or the Democratic Party is going to wake up, like, no, they're married to a completely different ideological project. And the only thing that they might be interested in doing is how to upgrade their models to fit a different moment. And that's, by the way, another thing that's very dangerous about this time, because I actually really do think that as markets become more scarce, as the ability to generate bubbles becomes more difficult, to sort of juice the system and get more broader buy-in, and you don't want to do redistribution because that raises people's expectations too much and that takes on too many incumbent interests. This is what Adolf's point has been, that dynamic favors the more right-wing side of neoliberalism, the more authoritarian, the more brutal, the more, kicking people down. And if you look at the Europeans, it's very interesting because they, the European centrists decry left and right-wing populism, but what they do is they object rhetorically and morally to aspects of right-wing populism while actually adopting a lot of the underlying, as an example, migration policies. And then they will fight to the mat, to the death, to never allow any type of this left economic program. And honestly, Syriza should have been the very clear lesson on that, because what Syriza was asking for when they first came into office in 2015 was very basic stuff. They were not asking to collectivize the means of production in Greece. They were saying, help us help you by not squeezing our economy with austerity. And the Troika wouldn't let that happen.
Yeah, I think it's true, but I think I really like I really like this distinction that Anton Jaeger has been making a lot about neoliberalism lately, where he calls it hard but hollow, where it doesn't have it's hard in that it can come down really strong, to break up social movements, to arrest people, all those kind of hard powers of the state. But its actual economic control of the economic system inside of the state is actually quite hollow, and its connection to the base and to the mass is quite hollow. So, they're also they're in a position of weakness too, in a way, and I think that we need to figure out how to operate around that. They're not able to organize society as completely as you would think, with how effective they can be at stopping social movements. When in power, they can't organize society in general and the economy in general to do what they want, which is high growth rates, right? They can't create that anymore.
That's true. They can't do high growth rates. That's true. I think, that is where we're not in the 90s anymore. But again, the dangerous thing becomes, does that filter to a slightly more kind of right-wing position. And I still think in the kind of elite world that there is a fight between that Singapore model and that Hungary model.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.